had the opportunity this week to use the church's Costco card to purchase snacks for youth group for our weekly Friday night get-togethers. And not being a regular Costco shopper, which I realize already puts me outside the norms of polite society, I am always jarred immediately upon entrance. To begin with, the shopping carts are a full 50% larger than a normal grocery store cart. Makes me feel like a child playing with grown-up things. They're unwieldy, guiding them through aisles and lanes where you can't even see around the corner because the boxes of merchandise are literally stacked to the ceiling. The whole place is like a Honey, I Shrunk the Kids experience, full of larger-than-life vitamin bottles and televisions and snacks and cleaning products and personal hygiene products and frozen food and enormous cans of staples like tomato sauce and pasta and applesauce and nuts and, well, almost everything or anything that most of us would wish to put on a grocery list. And the lines, of course, exist in the same oversized scale as every other product in stock. The abundance of these places is unreal. And it makes no effort to be aesthetically pleasing, but that isn't why we go, is it? Standing in line, one becomes aware that we are all there for one of two reasons: scarcity of money, hoping to stretch paychecks and budgets that haven't grown with the pace of inflation, or scarcity of time, hoping that one shopping trip will extend beyond the stretch of a usual weekly grocery run, saving us time in the future. These famines of time and resources are shared across society, even in an age of extreme income inequality. Anxiety about having enough drives us not just to Costco once a month, but to strategize, invest, and protect resources like squirrels hoarding nuts for the winter. And in the middle of Costco, a palace of pallets of abundance, we are all united in our anxiety about scarcity. While far too many people have real reason for concern, it begs the question what the rest of us are so worried about. In recent months, we have heard stories of the rich and famous bribing colleges to accept their children, who have already been afforded every opportunity one could ever dream of. What drives this illogical sense of desperation? The rich, the famous, and the rest of us all seem to be wrestling with anxiety that should be at odds with the realities of our relative material success and comfort. It is so expected that we should always strive for more that it makes headlines when someone bucks this trend and seems to say, no, really, I have more than enough. Abigail Disney was making the rounds on the liberal media circuit a few weeks ago. I heard her on NPR and saw her in the New Yorker magazine, telling the story of how she was speaking out for a group called the Patriotic Millionaires, advocating for higher taxes for the ultra-wealthy, labor protections for the low-wage workers at Disney company properties, and making waves for her rejection of a life of lavishness. She said about herself, "I am the happiest rich lady you will ever meet." To break from anxious captivity to feelings of scarcity is not a byproduct of reaching a magical economic threshold. Disney's rarity and uniqueness shows us that even those at the very top of the economic period are more often than not beset by feelings that they don't have enough. A study about 10 years ago by economists at Princeton revealed just that. It found that the lower a person's annual income falls below $75,000, the unhappier they feel. But that no matter how much more than $75,000 people make, they don't report any greater degree of happiness. Lower income didn't cause sadness itself, but made people feel more ground down by the problems they already had. And conversely, increased wealth above that $75,000 threshold did nothing to assuage the daily stresses and anxieties of daily life. And this may not be so new a phenomenon. In one of the oldest stories of our faith, we hear of widespread famine in ancient Egypt. And it wasn't just ordinary people like Abraham's family who feared starvation, but Pharaoh himself. The story from Genesis tells us that he dreamt of starving cows and blighted grain. Images of famine haunting even the one who would be the very last to have to miss a meal. Pharaoh, who was able to employ armies of people to build storehouses of grain, was kept awake at night by nightmares. As Walter Brueggemann puts it, the one with everything dreams of insecurity. When I was a restaurant server, I had a recurring nightmare that would regularly awaken me in a full sweat. The dream would begin as a regular shift would, with a restaurant steadily filling with diners. I would start out greeting each table, bringing waters and menus, smoothly taking orders and delivering them to the kitchen, which was located down a flight of stairs in the basement. And as people ate, I would gracefully refill their water glasses before they were empty, clear plates promptly, and drop checks with a smile, all the while maintaining the timely turn of tables that made such a job quite lucrative for a recent college grad shortly after the financial recession of 2008. But then the dream would slowly accelerate in pace until I was dropping dishes, leaving diners exasperated waiting for their checks, confusing table numbers and screwing up orders, falling down the stairs, or standing in the middle of the room as it began to spin around me completely out of control. And the truth was that many nights at the restaurant felt just like that nightmare, that I couldn't keep up, my head spinning with orders and sequences of service, jealous of the more experienced servers who seemed to handle a Saturday night rush with grace and steadiness. None of them would have spilled red wine on a diner's white shirt on New Year's Eve, I was sure. But while some nights might have felt like a nightmare, they weren't. Anytime I got close to a total meltdown, those same coworkers who I was envious of would be the ones to pick up my slack, help me clear extra dishes, or pour water for my parched customers. The difference between my dreams and reality was that in my dreams, I was alone. But in reality, I was not. The illusion that we are alone to fend for ourselves is rooted deep in our culture. And it is out of this illusion that Jesus calls us. He calls us out of our isolation and into community, out of the market mentality and into a neighborhood. Jesus' economic teachings just don't make sense in market terms. Jesus' admonition today to strive first for the kingdom of God is preached to disciples who have just given up their livelihoods as fishermen to follow a strange teacher who will also tell them to leave everything, bring no money on their travels, and forgive all their debts. We don't need to imagine that the disciples had been getting rich off their meager fishing vocation to understand that what he is asking for is absurd from an individual's point of view. So absurd that the only way that people will do it, can do it, is through reliance on those around them and the shared experience of God's abundance. To give up the only source of income you have is to trust that you are entering a system in which provision is not an individual task. It's to understand that you are not the only one being asked to make that journey. The only thing more absurd than Jesus' teaching to go against every common sense way of approaching money is the absurdity of the recurring miraculousness of the abundance that surrounds them. Like the Israelites before them, who had to learn to forget about the famine that dominated their ancestors' lives in order to learn not to hoard the manna that God provided in the wilderness, the disciples must unlearn the ruthless accounting of the ruling Romans for the arithmetic of abundance that Jesus is pointing them to. Jesus calls us to live not out of the nightmares of scarcity, but out of the belief in God's abundance and into the reality of the interdependent present that we share with our neighbors. I'll share with you another story about working for tips, only because there's something about cash that shows us, I think, the rawness of human relationship to money. So later in my illustrious career in the service industry, I found myself working at a casino in the middle of a union organizing drive. Both the casino and the union organizing drive could be stories in themselves, but they won't be today. I'll focus on my job, which was as a player service rep, which was to wander around an assigned section of slot machines on the casino floor, prepared to help customers with questions, keep the machines humming with paper refills, and the strange phenomenon of paying out a jackpot. For those of you who aren't familiar with slot machines or casinos, The rare events when someone hits a jackpot means that they have won at least $1,200. And it would require one of us, someone in my position, to come and fill out the paperwork and literally count out cash or process a check to the winner. And in order to be prepared for such events, we each carried with us a wallet of thousands of dollars in cash that was literally chained to our waists. It's a strange sensation to be carrying on your body and responsible for sums of money but beyond what you will take home in your biweekly paycheck. Stranger still to be paying out jackpots, contributing to this illusion of winning for people who you knew had in actuality lost far more than they would win. The computer system of tracking made it quite easy to see that someone who might win $2,000 once, over months of gambling, was actually slowly hemorrhaging cash. And it might be a good point at this point to mention that addiction to gambling is very real, and there is help available for anyone who struggles with this. But the payout for us, the people who kept this whole operation humming, was not just in our paycheck, but in the hopes that when you went to count out $100 bills to someone for their jackpot, that they might hand you one of those $100 bills, or a 20 or something in between as a tip. And it was for these tips that our whole department hustled. Everyone had their own scheme. Women would flirt, men would make jokes or become fast friends with the winner, and everyone, even those who others agreed were quite lazy in most aspects of the job, would hustle. And therein lay the problem. When I started the job, the jackpots were a free-for-all. Anyone who was assigned to work in that section could answer the call, and you needed one other person to work with you for it, for verification's sake. So then the question would arise, what do you do with the tip? Do you split it just between the two of you who were present for the jackpot? Do you split it with everyone assigned in that section? For those of you who don't know, that's my son, so that's why I'm laughing. So, do you split it with the person who you worked for the jackpot? Do you split the tip with everyone assigned to that section? What if someone went on break in the middle of the process? Should they be included? And what if you just didn't like the person that you were working with? Needless to say, there were many disputes that arose from this predicament. An environment of competition, distrust, and complaint got worse when management changed the schedules and layout of the floor, and workers were transferred from one shift to another, revealing that certain hours were much more lucrative than others. So in the midst of all this, someone decided to propose something radical, a tip pool. All tips, every shift, every section, every worker, would go into a common pot, to be counted and divided based on hours worked by a rotating committee of workers. And most remarkably, our motley crew of 60 or so employees agreed to this scheme. And almost overnight, work went from being 10 hours of intense competition, looking over your shoulder and obsessing over opportunities for cash, to a more relaxed, cooperative, and congenial place. We never won the union that we were fighting for, and we still worked in a place that served as a reverse ATM for many poor people who poured money into a ruthlessly addictive industry. But the decision to act as neighbors rather than competitors transformed our workplace from battlefield to neighborhood. The journey from a narrative of scarcity to a narrative of abundance is not one that we can make alone. That transformation is not just about the mental gymnastics of quieting our internal anxieties, but about connecting with the real presence of generosity and neighborliness within which we live. It's the ancient story of faith that God calls us to live out again. To break that narrative of scarcity and competition, we go from being lonely fishers with just ourselves and a rod to being fishers of people, casting a wide net to feed a whole crowd. We leave behind the famines of our ancestors' nightmares and learn to trust that each day manna will be provided. We hear the prayer that is not my daily bread, but our daily bread, and see the abundance of loaves and fishes that feed a crowd. So when the nightmares of scarcity threaten to haunt our decisions, may we be awake to the reality of abundance around us. When we start to believe that we are responsible only for ourselves, may we see anew the neighbors with whom we are blessed. And when we act out of market habits, may we be turned into caretakers of our neighborhood. Amen.